In the spring of 1967, on a sand bluff above the Pacific at the western edge of Los Angeles, a demolition operator swung a wrecking machine into a mansion of 6,400 square feet. The house was Spanish Moroccan, white walls and arched windows, and the people who lived around it called it the castle. From its upper rooms, you could see the ocean through one window and the runways of Los Angeles International Airport through the other. The operator worked down through tile and plaster that had been laid in the 1920s for one of the wealthiest households on the coast, and while he worked, up and down the streets of a neighborhood called Surfridge, moving vans were being loaded in front of other houses. In one of the streets behind him was the house where a boy named Steve Matilla grew up. One more address on the same list. The buyer of record had just paid $86,000 for the castle. The buyer of record was the airport. It had bought the house in order to destroy it, and it was buying all 822 homes around it, street by street, for the same purpose. And then it built nothing. Not a terminal, not a runway, not a parking structure, not so much as a maintenance shed. The streets are still there today, paved and curbed. The white and yellow lane paint still on the asphalt, running between empty squares of sand behind a locked fence at the west end of the airport. Los Angeles spent roughly $60 million erasing a beach neighborhood, and then left the ground bare for the next half-century. That was not an accident, and it was not indecision. In March of 1962, the United States Supreme Court had told every city that owned an airport, in plain language, exactly who was going to pay for the jet age. Los Angeles read that ruling and did arithmetic. The bulldozers were the arithmetic. And what the city tried to do with the emptied land afterward, for the next 30 years, is the part of this story that almost nobody tells. The arithmetic only makes sense if you understand what was standing on that bluff, and how a luxury neighborhood and an international airport came to be built 3,000 feet apart in the first place. That part begins in 1921, with two salesmen selling the same stretch of ground to two very different buyers. The bluff came first. It is a ridge of wind-built sand above the ocean, with the beach at its foot and a flat plain of barley fields running inland behind it. In 1921, a firm called the Dickinson and Gillespie Company subdivided the ridge and named the tract Palisades del Rey. The pitch was simple: $50 down, $20 a month for 3 years, and you owned a lot on the last empty oceanfront height in Los Angeles. That deposit works out to something like $770 in today's money. An ocean view on the installment plan for less than the price of a good used car now. To sell it, the company hired an army of salesmen, and one of them was a 22-year-old named Fritz Burns. Burns turned out to be one of the great salesmen in the history of a city built by salesmen. By 1924, the firm had moved its headquarters into a downtown Los Angeles building that would later earn its own place in the city's architectural histories, and its sales force on the Dune had grown past 100 men working on commission. Burns was on his way to becoming the dominant developer of the entire West Side. In 1934, oil was found on land he held in the hills just behind the Dune. Everything the man touched in that decade turned to money. In 1925, the developers ran a public contest to name the ocean-facing section of the tract, and they put up a prize of $1,000, which was more than a year and a half of payments on one of their own lots. The winning entry was Surfridge. The company praised the name for its brevity, its euphony, and its ease of pronunciation. Serious money and serious care spent naming a place that would exist for barely 50 years. Meanwhile, down on the barley plain behind the Dune, a different salesman was working a different customer. In July of 1927, a real estate agent, William Mines, offered the city of Los Angeles 640 acres of the Bennett Ranch fields as a site for a municipal airport. On July 25, 1928, the city council chose it. On August 13th, the city signed the lease. On October 1st, Mines Field opened, a dirt strip and a row of hangars in the barley, about 3,000 feet from the nearest lots of Palisades del Rey. Nobody sold those lots with an airport in the picture, and nobody chose that airfield with a luxury subdivision in mind. Two salesmen, 3,000 feet apart, one selling ocean views and one selling flat, empty land, in the same land boom, in the same decade. For 30 years, almost nobody noticed that the two sales could not both stay true forever. As for what the buyers on the ridge believed they were getting, parts of their brochure have been repeated as history for a century. The neighborhood that grew on the ridge was small, rich, and deliberately hard to reach. Its residents looked down on the beach from a private height, far from downtown, connected to the rest of the city by the Pacific Electric red cars, and by little else. And from the very beginning, its reputation rested on famous names. Cecil B. DeMille appears in nearly every account of Surfridge ever written. So does the actor Charles Bickford. I went looking for a deed, an address, a census line, anything that would put either man on that bluff, and I could not find one. The claims may all be quoting each other, and there is a detail that suggests where they started. A university magazine that dug into the neighborhood's history found the names of Douglas Fairbanks, Louis B. Mayer, and the cowboy star Hopalong Cassidy not in any property record, but in the developer's own advertising. Which means the legend of the movie stars of Surfridge may be a piece of 1920 sales copy that has been repeated as fact for 100 years. The salesmen were that good. What is documented is narrower and darker. One published history of the neighborhood states flatly that Surfridge was sold to white buyers only. Racially restrictive covenants were standard boilerplate in Los Angeles subdivisions of that decade. So the claim is very likely true, but likely is not proof, and the deed that would settle it has not surfaced. If it says what the era suggests it says, then the enclave this story mourns was itself built on exclusion, and both halves of that sentence deserve to be remembered together. Everything in the next minute of this story is what the city of Los Angeles later decided had to go. The dune at its height was the closest thing the city ever built to a private balcony over the ocean. The crest stood about 130 feet above the water, the highest ground on that stretch of coast, and the streets ran along it in curves engineered for the view. The houses went up through the 20s and 30s in stucco and Spanish tile, and the grandest of them belonged to Fritz Burns himself, the salesman made good, who built his mansion on the ridge with a ballroom of 1,000 square feet and windows that swept 270 degrees of coastline. From that room, you could watch the sun go down into the Pacific, and then, turning, watch the derricks pumping on the oil land he held in the hills behind the dune. His contemporary and rival Harry Culver had built a city inland and put his own name on it. Burns bet on the ocean instead, and for 2 decades, the bet looked perfect. The isolation was the product. No streetcar crowds, no downtown soot, just the red cars running the coast for the commute and the beach at the bottom of the bluff path for the children. The histories that survive describe an isolated playground for the wealthy, and for once, the promotional language and the recorded fact appear to agree. $1,000 name, movie stars in the advertising, terms of $50 down, and the last private ocean view in Los Angeles County. Carry that picture forward, because every person in the rest of this story will be arguing about what it was worth. Through the 30s and 40s, the houses in the airfield grew up side by side without much friction. Propeller aircraft were loud, but loud the way a truck is loud. An interruption rather than an occupation. The airfield next door, though, was quietly becoming something else, and the record of its growth reads like a countdown. In 1930, the dirt strip in the Barley was formally dedicated as the Los Angeles Municipal Airport. In 1937, the city stopped leasing and bought the land under it outright. And that purchase matters more than it looks, because it is the moment a temporary neighbor became a permanent institution with a deed. The transformation came after the war. In 1946, 4 major carriers, Trans World Airlines, American, United, and Western, moved their scheduled operations down from Burbank, and the modest field became the dominant commercial airport of the entire region almost overnight. In 1949, it took the name it holds today, Los Angeles International Airport. Then came a transaction that almost nobody noticed at the time, and that reads very differently now. In 1950, the city's Department of Airports bought a 60-acre parcel inside Surfridge itself, up on the residential ridge, for a radar navigation installation, a beacon that incoming aircraft steer by. 60 acres of a functioning beach neighborhood, purchased by the airport next door, 15 years before anyone spoke the word buyout. For the next decade and a half, that government fence sat in the middle of the streets like a tenant nobody remembered inviting. The first bite had already been taken, and the neighborhood does not seem to have read it as one. The red cars stopped running in those same years. Service to the beach cities thinned through the 40s and was gone entirely by 1961. And Surfridge, like everywhere else in Los Angeles, belonged to the automobile. Life on the dune through the 50s stayed close to the original promise. Children walked down the bluff path to the wide state beach at Dockweiler below, the same sand their grandparents had been sold in the brochures. It was not all old money by then either. People rented houses on the dune too, and one former tenant, an interior designer interviewed decades later, remembered it simply as a fantastic neighborhood. The propellers droned and turned overhead, and people raised their voices a little and got on with their afternoons. What ended that truce was not more airplanes. It was a different kind of airplane, and the first one left the runway in January of 1959. That month, an American Airlines Boeing 707 took off from Los Angeles International Airport for New York, carrying the first jet passengers ever to leave the field. 2.5 years later, on June 25, 1961, the airport dedicated its new jet-age heart, the satellite terminals, and the arched white theme building that still stands on postcards today, with Vice President Lyndon Johnson presiding over the ceremony. United's jets took the first 2 of the new satellite terminals, numbers 7 and 8, that same summer. The city had built itself the front door of the jet age on the West Coast. It owned every acre under it, and through it the jets came. Here is what that looked like from inside a house on the ridge, in numbers the city itself would later confirm in court. In 1960, an average of 55 jets a day landed at the airport. In 1962, 129. In 1963, 164. By 1965, 238 jets were landing every day, more than 4 times the traffic of 5 years earlier. Spread across a day, that is a jet on the approach roughly every 6 minutes, around the clock, and departures on top of it. Every one of those flights was permitted, scheduled, and counted by the city that owned the field, and the departure paths ran directly over and beside the houses on the dune. Duke Dukesherer, a local historian who grew up in the area and has spent years collecting the neighborhood stories, describes the change in 2 stages. Before the late 50s, you raised your voice a bit when you talked outside. After the jets came, you stopped talking entirely and waited for the aircraft to pass. Conversation on a patio became a thing conducted in gaps. A radio history that gathered residents' memories decades later recorded the same detail, and one more: soot. Fine black grime from the early jet engines, settling on windowsills and porch rails and outdoor furniture, and complaints about breathing that nobody in authority was measuring. That last claim comes from a single broadcast and should carry that label. The stopped conversations are everywhere in the record. Now put that beside what this place had been sold as: brevity, euphony, ease of pronunciation. An isolated playground above the sea, a $1,000 name, ocean views on installment. By the early 60s, Surfridge was a neighborhood that no honest brochure could describe anymore. And in March of 1962, while the schedules thickened month by month, the Supreme Court of the United States decided a case about an airport outside Pittsburgh, and the ground under every one of those houses legally shifted. The law had been moving toward Los Angeles for years. In 1946, in a case brought by a North Carolina chicken farmer, Cosby, whose terrified birds were killing themselves against the walls of their coop as military aircraft skimmed his barn, the Supreme Court ruled that low and frequent flights over a property could amount to the government taking that property, just as surely as if it had been seized on paper. That planted the principle. The question it left open was enormous, because somebody has to pay for a taking, and around every jet airport in America, there were suddenly thousands of properties under the flight paths, and the court had not yet said who owed the money. In March of 1962, in a case called Griggs against Allegheny County, it said, the man who gave the case its name owned a house near the end of a runway outside Pittsburgh, close enough that airliners on the approach crossed just above his chimney, low enough that his family eventually gave up and moved out. He sued the county that owned the airport. The county pointed at the airlines and at the federal government that had drawn the flight path, and the Supreme Court settled it. Not the airlines flying the planes, not the federal government that designed the airways and licensed every aircraft. The owner of the airport pays, the proprietor. In Pittsburgh, that meant the county. In Los Angeles, it meant the city of Los Angeles, which had owned its airport outright since 1937, and which had cut the ribbon on its new jet terminals 10 months before the ruling came down. From March of 1962 onward, the city was on formal notice from the highest court in the country that every decibel it scheduled over the dune was, potentially, a debt. And with that notice in hand, the city kept expanding. 55 daily jet landings became 238 across exactly the window in which the Supreme Court had told airport owners they would carry the cost. A court would later comb the evidence and fix the precise month in which the noise around the airport crossed the line from nuisance into a legal taking of property. The month it chose was May of 1963, 14 months after Griggs. For the litigation that was coming, an acoustics firm called Bolt, Baranek & Newman mapped the noise around the airport using a federal method called the Noise Exposure Forecast, which grades the ground under flight paths into zones. The blocks along the dune fell into the worst zone, Area C, where, in the language the court adopted, single-family construction is not recommended because noise is likely to be a severe interference with using the land for homes. Hold on to what that actually means. A federal standard methodology formally classified that ground as unfit for houses while the houses were still full of people. The forecast did not measure one loud afternoon. It combined how loud each aircraft type was with how many flew and when, flights at night weighing heavier than flights at noon. And it drew the results as contour lines on a map, like the elevation lines on a hiking chart, except that the altitude they measured was noise. Inside the worst contour, the federal guidance said, in effect, do not let anyone build a home here. The homes were already there. The city had the map. The city was scheduling the flights that drew the contours, and the city owned the ground the contours were closing over. So, by the middle of the 60s, the city held a very clear ledger. On one side, a neighborhood that could sue it forever, with the Supreme Court's blessing. On the other, the price of making the neighborhood disappear. In 1965, it moved. What the city did first, according to the record we have, was hold a vote. Reporting by David Farrell, a staff writer at the Los Angeles Times, says that in 1965, the homeowners of Surfridge were polled on their own removal, and that more than 66% elected to sell to the airport, with the remaining properties to be condemned. Precision matters here, because that single sentence carries enormous weight. It is the difference between a neighborhood that chose to leave and a neighborhood that was forced out, and it rests on one newspaper feature. No ballot, no record of who administered the vote, no evidence of whether it bound anyone has ever surfaced. Nor does any published history name the airport commissioners who voted the acquisition rounds through. Their names sit in minute books at the city clerk's office, unexamined. The officials who erased the neighborhood are, so far, as anonymous as the people who resisted them. What is beyond dispute is what followed. Between 1965 and 1975, in 4 separate rounds of purchase and condemnation, the Department of Airports emptied Surfridge. Each round worked the same way: an appraisal, an offer, and for anyone who refused the offer, a condemnation filing, which is the state's power to take private property at a price a court will set. Willing sellers first, the courthouse for the rest. Round by round, block by block, the lit windows thinned. Even the ending is blurred in the record. One account dates the last removals to about 1972. The Times runs the vacations through 1975. What no account disputes is the count. 822 homes vacated, more than 2,000 people relocated. The Times put the total cost at around $60 million and reported that 3/4 of it was reimbursed by the federal government. Nobody involved ever disputed the scale. Set that against what the money bought. $60 million, most of it federal, to purchase a fully built neighborhood on the last high ground over the ocean in Los Angeles and flatten it. What the city meant to do with the ground once the houses were gone, no letter to any homeowner ever said. The castle went early. $86,000 in 1967 for 6,400 square feet above the Pacific. And then the wrecking machine we started with. Remember that number, $86,000. It is going to come back twice more in this story, and each return is worse. The 66%, whatever the true figure was, had taken the money. The story of the people who refused is harder to tell, and the reason it is hard says something about how thoroughly this neighborhood was erased. Some people would not sign. The radio history of Surfridge states plainly that police enforcement was required to remove some residents from their homes, and one written account says a handful of owners sued and held on for years inside an emptying street grid, their porch lights the last ones burning on their blocks. Here is what I cannot tell you. A single name. 822 households, some of them removed by officers within living memory, in a major American city, and not one published account names one holdout. No court file with a Surfridge address has surfaced. The record holds the fact of resistance and has lost the people who did the resisting. Not every house died either. Moving a whole house was an ordinary trade in mid-century Los Angeles, and some of the Dunes houses were jacked up whole, set on trailers, and driven off to new lots elsewhere in the city. Nobody counted how many, and nobody tracked where they went. Somewhere in that city today, there are almost certainly kitchens and living rooms that were built on the Surfridge Dune in the 20s, and the families eating dinner in them may have no idea. The boy from the spring of 1967 grew up to sell real estate for a living, which gives his verdict on his childhood home a particular authority. You talk about prime real estate. Steve Matilla told the Times decades later. That is it. And Surfridge was not even the biggest clearance on the books. Across those same years, the airport's expansion took roughly 3,500 more homes in Westchester, on the inland side of the runways, about a third of that neighborhood's entire housing stock. Beside the dune's 822, that quiet inland clearance was more than 4 times the size of the famous one. The dune became the famous ghost. Westchester barely got a mention, and its people are even harder to find in the record than the holdouts on the ridge. And the taking around this airport never entirely stopped. As late as 2016, television news crews were still interviewing the last residents of streets being emptied for airport expansion, half a century after the first Surfridge letters went out. The families who sold assumed, reasonably, that the courts would eventually put a fair price on what the Jets had done to everyone. Their old neighbors just outside the buyout line, the ones who stayed, tested that assumption for a decade. And the number the courts handed back is the coldest fact in this story. The neighbor's case was called Aaron against the city of Los Angeles, and its timing tells you how early everyone understood what was happening. In January and February of 1964, a full year before the Surfridge buyout vote, the owners of about 750 parcels near the airport filed claims against the city, and then sued in what the law calls inverse condemnation, which means the government has taken value from your property without ever admitting it took anything. The city fought the case for 10 years, and its central argument was this: only a family with aircraft passing directly through the airspace over its own roof should recover anything at all. Miss the flight path by a block? Collect nothing. The court refused, because the California Constitution promises compensation when private property is taken or damaged, and damage does not travel in straight lines. Noise arriving sideways counts. That ruling mattered far beyond the case, because it meant every household within earshot of the runways was a potential creditor, not just the thin ribbon of homes directly beneath the jets. The trial court found that 581 parcels had been damaged by jet noise, and judgment was entered for 520 of them. On July 3, 1974, the Court of Appeal affirmed all of it. On paper, it reads as a landmark victory, 10 years in the making, for 520 households against the second largest city in the country, with a precedent underneath it that would hold for every airport neighborhood in California. Here is what winning looked like. The court measured each family's loss as the drop in what their home was worth, and the awards ran from $400 at the bottom to $6,000 at the top, clustering, in the court's own words, in the neighborhood of $1,000. A decade of litigation, a complete victory on the law, and a check for about $1,000 per house. Set that against the $86,000 the same city had paid for the castle. The city would pay handsomely to acquire and destroy. It would pay almost nothing to compensate and coexist. Hold those two prices side by side, and the bulldozers stop looking like a tragedy of circumstance. They start looking like what they were: the cheap option, chosen on purpose, by people who could count. For the families still under the approach, the victory changed a number on a page and nothing in the air. And the city's next move removes any doubt about how it saw the matter, because 7 weeks after losing Aaron, the city of Los Angeles was back in the same courthouse, this time as the one suing. Having been told it owed its neighbors for the noise, the city filed cross-complaints against 31 airlines and 2 aircraft manufacturers, seeking to make them cover the bill. Japan Airlines gave the case its name. American was on the list, and Flying Tiger Line, and the makers of the airframes and the engines, and a company called AW Liquidating, the paperwork remnant of an airline that no longer existed. 33 defendants in all, essentially the entire commercial aviation industry of the era, summoned to court by the landlord that had collected rent and landing fees from every one of them. The argument was simple: your planes made the noise, so indemnify us. On August 28, 1974, the Court of Appeal said no, and said it in a way that closed the door for good. Only a government body can acquire the airspace over approach paths. The airlines did not control that airspace and had no power over it. The proprietor pays. The opinion also recorded, in passing, the scale of what the city had been building all along: around $300 million in projected bonded debt for airport expansion, with the airlines paying increased landing fees toward the program. Higher fees, the court held, did not transfer the constitutional bill. So follow the sequence once, slowly. The city was warned in 1962 that it would pay for jet noise. It quadrupled jet traffic anyway. It bulldozed a neighborhood rather than owe it money. And then it sued 31 airlines and 2 manufacturers to make them pay for the noise after all, and lost. Under the flight paths, nothing changed but the name of the defendant. Every road led back to the same desk at City Hall. Still, the neighbors kept coming, because the noise had not stopped. The last of the 3 great cases reached the Supreme Court of California at the end of the decade, and this one put a price not on houses, but on sleep. Homeowners in Westchester had sued in 1968, and this time, not for property value, but in nuisance, for injury to themselves. The trial came in 1975, judgment in 1976, and on December 14, 1979, the state's highest court affirmed it. The findings read like a diary. The noise interfered with person-to-person conversation inside the home. It caused frequent arousal from sleep. Behind those 2 dry clauses were households whose dinners stopped mid-sentence and whose nights came apart, evening after evening, from 1967 through 1975. 41 plaintiffs shared the award, and the award was $86,000. The trial court also ordered the city to pay $200,000 toward the homeowners' lawyers, a sum well over twice the damages themselves, though the fee award was later trimmed on appeal. Divide the damages out, and 8 years of broken sleep came to roughly 70 cents a night per person. By the end, victory over the airport cost more in lawyers than it paid in relief. The figure is worth sitting with: $86,000, divided among 41 people, for 8 years of broken nights. It is, to the dollar, what the airport had paid for 1 mansion on the dune. That is not a metaphor. That is the same number, appearing twice in the same ledger, once for a building and once for the sleep of 41 human beings over most of a decade. And the timing carries its own weight. The ruling came down 4 years after the last Surfridge house was already gone. The people of the dune were bought, moved, and scattered years before the law finished deciding what their suffering had been worth. Now the honest counter case, because there is one, and it deserves its minute. The noise was real. The federal contour map was not a lawyer's trick. It described houses in which sleep and conversation genuinely failed, and no ruling of any court was going to quiet a runway. The technology that eventually did, quieter engine designs, and a national framework of noise rules and soundproofing money, did not exist yet. The act of Congress that built that framework, the Aviation Safety and Noise Abatement Act, passed in 1979, 4 years after the last Surfridge family was gone, and the soundproofing programs it funded went on to rework homes around this same airport. In 1965, the city's realistic menu had 2 items on it: buy the land or be sued by its owners, year after year, forever. Or do nothing at all and be sued anyway. Aaron and the Westchester cases are what being sued forever looked like. And if the Times reporting on the vote is right, 2/3 of the homeowners looked at the same menu and chose the check. Put in those terms, the clearance was rational, even defensible. A liability was retired, and people trapped under a flight path were paid to escape it. The problem with the defense is everything that happened next. A city that clears land purely to end a nuisance turns the land into a park or a beach lot, or gives it back to the county, and stops thinking about it. This city fenced its cleared land, held it, and spent the next 3 decades trying to turn it into revenue. That is the part of the record the sympathetic reading cannot survive, and it is where this story goes now. The clearance left the city holding more than 470 fenced acres of bare coastal sand it had spent $60 million to empty. The honest statement of what came next was made by the airport's own spokesman, Harold Johnson, on the record with the Los Angeles Times. The plan, he said, is no plan at all. He was telling the truth. No terminal was ever drawn for that ground. No runway was ever extended into it. But no plan at all was not quite the whole truth either, because for the next 30 years there were plans. They were just never plans for the public to live with. Through the 80s, the city floated a golf course for the site, and the California Coastal Commission turned it down. The first 80 acres of dune were set aside for habitat in those same debates, a fraction that will matter shortly. In 1992, the city tried again inside a new coastal plan, which was found incomplete and withdrawn, though the same planning round did put the southern 200 acres under a dunes preserve designation. The northern 100 acres stayed in play. In 1994, that 100 was zoned as open space, restricted, in the words of the ordinance, to a nature preserve and accessory uses only. That reads like an ending. It was not one. In 2001, the airport's own master plan carried the same 100 acres coded as either a golf course or a hotel resort. 36 years after the first buyout letters went out, the city of Los Angeles was still holding open the option of a resort on ground it had cleared, with mostly federal money, on the argument that no human being could reasonably live there. The land was too loud for a bedroom, but apparently fine for a hotel. And keep in mind whose money had assembled the asset. 3/4 federal reimbursement means the taxpayers of the United States bought the city of Los Angeles more than 470 acres of Pacific coastline for roughly a quarter of its cost. No private developer could have assembled that parcel on the open market at any price. The golf course drawings and the hotel coding were not idle sketches on surplus land. They were a city quietly holding, for 30 years, an oceanfront asset its own noise had emptied and the federal treasury had mostly paid for. What killed the option was not conscience, and it was not the city's own zoning. The Coastal Commission answered that the dunes were an environmentally sensitive habitat area under Section 3240 of the California Coastal Act, and that a golf course or hotel there would raise serious issues of conformity with the law. In the Commission's dialect, that is the word no. The resort died on that finding, and on nothing else. One more detail belongs in the record here. The paper trail for this entire chapter, the zoning codes, the plan documents, the Commission's responses, survives in one assembled file because a small conservation group collected and published it. The city's own telling of Surfridge does not include this chapter at all. And the reason the Commission could make that finding at all? The reason a bulldozed subdivision counted as sensitive habitat is the strangest turn in this entire story. It is about an inch of blue. On June 1st, 1976, in the pages of the Federal Register, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service listed 6 butterflies as endangered species under an act of Congress that was itself barely 3 years old. One of them was the Segundo blue, a butterfly about the size of a thumbnail that lives its entire life on a single plant. It lays its eggs in the flower heads of the seacliff buckwheat. Its caterpillars eat the flowers, and the adults rarely fly more than a few hundred feet from the plant they hatched on. The buckwheat grows on coastal dunes, and almost every coastal dune in its range had been paved, planted, or built over by exactly the kind of development that created Surfridge in the first place. Its entire world was a strip of sand along the southern curve of Santa Monica Bay, and the subdivision boom of the 20s had taken nearly all of it. 5 other butterflies were listed the same day, every one of them a California habitat specialist running out of ground. Fewer than 500 Segundo blues were thought to survive anywhere on Earth. The listing came 1 year after the last houses on the dune came down. Keep the order of those events straight, because nearly every telling of this story eventually gets it backwards. The city did not clear Surfridge to save a butterfly. The city cleared Surfridge for noise, and then discovered, a year later, that it had accidentally manufactured the one thing the butterfly needed to survive. A large, fenced, untrafficked, unwatered stretch of open dune on the Los Angeles coast. The lawns died without sprinklers. The buckwheat came back through the dead lawns, and the blue came back with the buckwheat. It was not a rescue. It was a byproduct. The most protected piece of coastal habitat in Los Angeles exists because demolishing a neighborhood was cheaper than paying its residents what the noise had cost them. And the city still was not done trying to make the sand pay. In 1986, a formal dune restoration project began on the site. Crews pulled out the ice plant that decades of landscaping had spread across the coast, reseeded the native buckwheat through the old front yards, and the counts have been climbing ever since. Counts made since the restoration began run to the tens of thousands, and the sources genuinely disagree on the figure. 50,000 in one account, 3 times that in another. Set either number against fewer than 500, and the recovery is real regardless of which count you trust. And hold both halves of the picture at once. The same acreage that produced this recovery is the acreage the city was still coding as a golf course or hotel resort in 2001. The butterfly did not change the city's plan. It outlasted it. What the ground is now, anyone can see, because in October of 2025, the airport published a virtual tour of the site, and what it shows matches what photographers at the fence line have documented for years. The full street grid, paved and curbed, sidewalks and driveways that end in sand, streetlight poles and power lines serving nobody, water mains and sewers still buried under the dune, plumbing for a city of ghosts. Palm trees planted in the 20s, most of them dead, standing like burned matches along the old avenues. And on the asphalt, the road paint. White and yellow lines, still holding their lanes. The last street a car could legally drive, Sandpiper Street, was closed to through traffic in 2001, and the site was sealed entirely in the security clampdown after September 11th. The perimeter, as the tour shows it, is green chain link topped with barbed wire, chained and padlocked at the old street entrances. The photographers who documented the fence line across the previous decade found weathered police tape still knotted at some of the gates. Not every neighbor sees a sanctuary in there either. Lon Cadis, whose home borders the empty ground, gave the Times his own 4-word review of half a century of dead palms and blowing sand. It is a mess. The airport now claims the dunes as an achievement, and the numbers it publishes are genuinely remarkable. 307 acres of coastal dune on the airport's western edge, home by the airport's own count to more than 900 species of native plants and animals. The cleared ground was always larger than the preserve, which is exactly why a golf course kept fitting on the drawings. The blue is there, so is a legless lizard and a horned lizard, and in 2019 biologists found burrowing owls nesting in the preserve, ground-dwelling birds that have been disappearing from coastal Los Angeles County for decades, settling into what the Los Angeles Times called priceless coastal real estate. The restoration is run with a conservation nonprofit called the Bay Foundation, and volunteers work the dune on scheduled days. The agency that once bought houses in order to silence their owners now runs habitat days on the ground where the houses stood. And most of what anyone knows about the life that ground once held traces back to one man, Duke Dukesherer, the local historian from earlier in this story, who spent decades collecting Surfridge before the people who remembered it were scattered past finding. The airport will let a camera inside, with a permit, an escort, and about a week's notice. And the neighborhood is on its official list of filming locations, which means the streets the public cannot touch are available by the day to productions that pay. Everyone else sees it from 3 places. From Vista Del Mar, the public road that runs along the ocean side of the fence. From Dockweiler below the bluff, where the dune face rises above the sand and the beach the Surfridge children once walked down to now sits directly under the departure paths, fire rings, and picnic tables beneath the climbing jets. And from one small city park at the northern edge called Vista Del Mar Park, the only parcel of the old neighborhood still open to the public. Stand at that fence at dusk, with the jets sliding down over the water toward the runways, and the lane paint glowing faintly on the empty grid, and the scale of the transaction finally becomes visible in a single view. The airport on one side, the source of all the noise and all the money, the bare streets on the other, everything the money bought. Between them, a chain link fence and 60 years. The place stops reading as a ruin. It reads as what it actually is, a ledger, written in asphalt, still open. Surfridge was never built on because building was never the point. The point was to stop owing. In March of 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that the owner of an airport pays for what its noise takes from the people under the flight paths. The city of Los Angeles owned the airport, and under its flight paths sat 822 houses it could never quiet. Buying them all at once, 3/4 of it on federal money, was cheaper than owing their owners forever, and the courts themselves eventually proved the arithmetic right. $1,000 a house for the neighbors who stayed and sued for a decade. $86,000 among 41 people for 8 years of ruined sleep. Against numbers like those, $60 million was a bargain, and the empty ground behind the fence is the receipt. 59 years after the wrecking crew climbed through the castle, the receipt is still filed, photographed most recently by the airport itself, and nobody has ever had to sign for it. The streets are still there, the curbs are still there, the streetlights are still there, dark over empty corners. The water mains are still there, under the sand, plumbed for houses that have been gone for 50 years. The buckwheat is still spreading through the old front yards, and the blue is still flying over 100 acres the city once marked down for a golf course. And 3,000 feet east, the jets are still landing, every one of them scheduled by the city that decided 60 years ago that the cheapest way to live beside its own airport was to make sure nobody else had to. White lines and yellow lines, on streets that go nowhere, marking lanes on land nobody was ever allowed to use again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button in the middle to watch more forgotten places and abandoned history from across America. Then click the video on the left to watch similar stories like this. Or if you really want to get stuck in, click the playlist on the right. New videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.